I am Darrick Hamilton, the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, university professor and Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School. And I'm happy to be here today and talk a little bit about ways in which the discipline can redress some power and inequality that exist in our society, the discipline of economics. So racism, sexism, and other isms are not simply irrational prejudices, but long leveraged strategic mechanisms for exploitation and extraction that have benefited some at the expense of others. This is unjust, immoral, and all about power relationships. A particular strength of university communities is its intellectual foundations. Shielded by the honors and privileges of tenure, it is an intellectual foundation that provides university faculties with a comparative advantage to conduct values-based, truth-seeking, rigorous research, however controversial it may be. Understanding persistence and extreme inequality and the pivotal roles that race and other group identities play in forging political alignments and economic divisions should be core of what universities are doing. Without such an analysis, the scholarly community and universities writ large are complicit in the immoral continued trajectory towards stratification, both within and across nation state. Personally, I'm not motivated to be a scholar solely for my love of knowledge and knowledge creation. My objective as an economist is to produce knowledge with the explicit intent of building values like economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity, and what the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen has labeled human capabilities, enabling people to define and attain their self-determined goal. One need not sacrifice rigor to study how institutions and behaviors intertwine with an objective of building economic inclusion. Likewise, we need to recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms, especially scholarship that claims to study production, transaction, and distributions. I believe we should embrace the principles of morality, decency, and economic sustainability in a vision and plan to address inequality and political economy. The structures of our political economy and race go well beyond class and individual bigotry. As a matter of course, across the American and global institutional landscapes, race and other social identities, they are strategically used to generate hierarchy and propel systems of stratification and persistent inequality. In other words, they're not simple matters of bigotry. However, our contemporary political economy radically situates the market, a proverbial market, as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. Race, along with government social programs, they're used as scapegoats to fuel this neoliberal agenda. Poverty and inequality are attributed to deficiencies internal to the poor and Blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and anti-Blackness, these are strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks are the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators by which we're able to define a surplus population. The presumptions in that narrative pay little attention to the roles of power and initial endowment or capital, and how power and capital can adjust to alter rules and structures of transactions and markets in order to privilege power and capital in the first place. Without capital and power, inequality is locked in. Words like choice, freedom, they're used to describe the benefits of the market, but choice is an illusion if an individual lacks basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, and health care. It is literally wealth that gives us choice. It gives us freedom and optionality. Authentic economic agency and freedom are rooted in resources, political resources, social resources, psychological resources, and especially material resources. Power and capital are self-reinforcing. Without government interventions, they will do what they do best. They will consolidate and they will iterate. Orthodox economics is based on a dogma, a faith that markets are somehow natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable. This belief does not give enough credence to the political actions that form and codify markets in the first place. Instead, the presumption that markets are somehow simply natural, it leads to a false notion of fairness, that somehow if each individual is free to pursue their own profit and happiness, that this will ultimately lead to a greater good for society. But our unjust racial wealth gap is itself an implicit measure of a racist past that is rooted in a history in which whites have been privileged by government, complicit political and economic interventions that have afforded them access to these resources and the iterative and intergenerational accumulation that comes along with these resources. This is in contrast to a history in which Black people and Indigenous people, their personhood and whatever capital and resources they may have established have been vulnerable to exploitation and extrapolation, and here's a key word, by state complicit confiscation, destruction, terror, fraud, theft, and other acts of violence. As a result, Blacks as a group have very little ownership in America's land and means of production and remain in fear of violence, incarceration, and literally bondage. Yet much of the framing of the racial wealth gap, including the use of alternative financial service products, focus on poor financial choices and decision-making on the part of largely Black, Latino, and poor borrowers. This framing is wrong. The directional emphasis is wrong. It is more likely that meager economic circumstance, not poor decision-making or deficient knowledge, constrains choice itself and leaves poor borrowers with little to no other options but to attain and use predatory and abusive financial services. We know that education matters, and it matters particularly within group. But since social structures do not permit Black people to convert education into desired outcomes at the same rate as it does whites, they're not protected by that social class status in the same way that whites are. Racial differences in key outcomes cannot be fully explained by a clustering amongst the less skilled. Unsurprisingly, within each group, more education is associated with better outcomes. However, the irony is that across groups, Black workers with a college degree are the most harmed in a relative sense to similarly qualified white workers, and that difference across education becomes amplified during recessions. This does not diminish the value of education. There's clear intrinsic value, along with a public responsibility to expose everyone with a high quality education with empathetic teachers from grade school all the way through college. It is a myth that Black families don't value education, and also problematic is our social emphasis or overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address socially established structural barriers. Basically, we overstate the functional role of education to the detriment of understanding the functional roles of resources and power. Indeed, I wonder if this overemphasis on education to promote economic opportunity, is it a political ruse? Basically, does framing inequality as an opportunity gap serve the purpose of reinforcing market norms that put the onus of inequality on the individual while absolving the state from public responsibility? Scholars and economists in particular should do a better job of understanding the roles of power and capital in our political economy and be more focused on understanding and advocating for structures that truly lead to more equitable and fairer distributions. We're not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by a free will into fair and efficient allocation. Conventional economics views race prejudice as an exogenously determined binary that represents preferences, tastes, bigotry, or ignorance that over time should be arbitraged away by non-bigoted, profit-seeking, efficient firms. This ignores the strategic agency and benefits that individuals have in choosing and investing in their collective group identity, and how social structures may increase or decrease the value, and the incentives to invest in that identity. This is the impetus for the psychological and the material benefits of white privilege, or the property rights in white privilege. But this privilege is based on an amoral, or more accurately, immoral notion of benefit, that it is largely predicated on self-interested neoliberal and tribal norms in which accumulation knows no bounds. An authentic racial coalition to address our growing inequality would necessitate that the dominant white group give up the benefits of white privilege. But that is obviously not an easy ask. But I also want to be clear that I'm not calling for the end of identity or affinity groupings, but rather the importance as they relate to material outcomes. So in closing, I have a call to arms to the university communities and economists that we should commit to justice, commit to it as a matter of faith, simply because it is the right thing to do. We are well equipped to fuse insights from multiple disciplines to improve our humanistic, social, scientific, and political understandings of group-based stratification in local, national, and international contexts. We should use our vast and highly subsidized resources to produce high quality and impactful work that generate innovative strategies, policies, and investments that break down restrictive hierarchies, empower people, and move society towards greater equity, particularly as these restrictive hierarchies relate to one's cursory group-based identity, such as race, gender, and sexual orientation.